Educational GMAT. Your partner in your GMAT journey.
I want a discussion with you guys here. This is clearly a premise, right? On the basis of the premise, this is the conclusion, correct? Just because more number of newspapers are sold in town S, the argument is concluding that citizens of town S are better informed. We have to weaken this. So can you guys think of some loopholes in this argument? Sorry? Very nice. Absolutely. There could be more number of people in town S than in town T. In other words, again, what we are essentially saying is more number of newspapers does not translate to a greater percentage of people. Very nice. We don't know the newspaper type. For example, if most of the newspapers that were sold in town S were, let's say, newspapers that cover Bollywood news, right? Then we clearly cannot conclude that citizens of town S are better informed about world events. Very nice. So all these are very genuine things that should come to your mind. Good. Okay. This says each of the following, if true, would weaken the conclusion except. In all except questions, I did discuss this. Please make this a standard operating procedure. Once you identified the conclusion, and we have identified the conclusion, in except questions, for each option, keep marking that option as S if it strengthens the conclusion, W if it weakens the conclusion, and O if it is outside the scope. All right. Now, weakens the conclusion except would mean what? S and O would qualify. Right? All right. Let us start with the alpha. Tell me, does it strengthen the conclusion or weaken the conclusion or is outside the scope?
Weaken.
Weakens, right? Clearly, alpha weakens it because alpha is essentially saying that the reason the greater number of newspapers are sold in town S is because it has a larger population, greater number of people, which does not, so which means does not translate into percentage. Okay. How about Baker? Again weakens because it says most citizens in town T work in town S and buy their newspapers there. So which means basically what Baker is saying is that while a greater number of newspapers are sold in town S than in town T, but then a large number of newspapers that are sold in town S are actually bought by residents of town T. So which clearly weakens, because from this we obviously cannot conclude that citizens of town S are better informed. All right, Charlie, the average citizen spends less time reading newspapers than does the average citizen of town T. Okay, all right. To me, it weakens, but let's keep it for now. How about David? A weekly newspaper restricted to. Notice this is what we are talking about. That we are talking about local events, and hence just because a large number of this newspaper is sold in town S, we clearly cannot conclude that people in town S are better informed about world events because this is about local events. So clearly weakening. All right, how about Edward? The average newsstand price of newspapers sold in town S is lower than the average price of newspapers sold in town T. Now, so we are basically left between Charlie and Edward. So what do you guys think? Average citizen of town S spends less time reading newspaper than does the average citizen of town T. All right. So between Charlie and Edward. All right. Edward is the right answer. Now notice basically what this is saying is how about Charlie? Now, what are your thoughts on Charlie? Because it's saying that while a large number of people may buy newspapers, but then they don't devote time. Since they are not devoting time in reading the newspaper, obviously they would be less informed about the world events. Okay. Uh, all right. Why Edward now?
So, I mean,
Sorry.
so the C statement is going wrong because it is
Okay.
saying that town spends less time reading newspaper, right? But it is possible that in less time they collect the information of the world. I mean, they they spend. I mean, they spend less time, but in less time only they can read the information of the world. I mean, they must be fast readers or something like that.
Yes. Which one? Edward. All right. All right. Okay. The average newsstand price of newspapers sold in town S. So Edward is saying the newsstand price is lesser. Okay. All right. First of all, coming to Charlie. Now the thing is, guys, that honestly speaking, there is really, I think this would be an additional big assumption, really, that people in town S are smarter than people in town T. In other words, despite the fact that average citizen uh, of town S spends lesser time reading newspaper, that average citizen is still able to grasp more in terms of world major events despite spending lesser time would be, I would say, a big assumption that people in town S are smarter. That would be a very big assumption, Saloni, according to me. In other words, what I'm saying is that again, the common sense does prevail here. The common sense does say that lesser the amount of time that I spend on a newspaper, lesser would be my recollection of what is mentioned in the newspaper. Do you agree this is a reasonable thing? Right? So for Charlie to bring in an additional assumption that perhaps people in town S are significantly smarter than people in town T, I am saying is a very big assumption which does not conform with the normal set of assumptions in logical reasoning. Clear? All right, let's. Okay, coming on to Edward. The average newsstand price, I mean, at least to some extent, it looks a bit. See, let's look at Edward. One is that you could obviously argue There are multiple ways to look at Edward. One is you could argue that price is out of scope. That's one thing. Secondly, you could also say that greater number of newspapers are sold in town S, not because people are genuinely interested in figuring out what's going on in the world news, but because it's available cheaper.